"Forget about it and take another drink," Joe told Henry James as they rode up to the open barbed wire gate, which lay snarled on the ground where some hunter visiting from the city had carelessly left it open. Henry reached over and grabbed the bottle from Joe, after Joe had glugged a large swallow. Henry tipped the bottle up to the sky and drank several swallows. "Sons of bitches!" he yelled. Joe grinned and said, "Yeah, sons of bitches, that's right. Makes you want to line them up against a wall and shoot every last city slicker son of a bitch of them. But we can't do that. Not today. Take another drink." They passed the bottle back and forth again. "Okay, might as well leave it open until we get them all back in from this South 40 pasture. Shouldn't be more than about 20 head, I think," Joe mused. They rode through the open gate and followed cow tracks out onto the vast federal government-owned pasture lands of the prairie. Steve Roseberg arrived at the Droke place at 5 in the morning. He found Joe saddling the 2 horses they would be riding. "Ready to bag a buck?" Steve good-naturedly asked Joe. "Why, sure," Joe drawled. Both men attached their rifles and scabbards to their saddles. They mounted and started riding west to the wide south opening into Chilcoot Canyon, and rode through it northward and on into Picketwire Canyon. Joe rode into camp in the late afternoon, a big buck draped over his horse's rump. There was good friend Steve, already dressing out his own buck, hanging from a rope upside down from the branch of a cottonwood tree. Steve was straddling a puddle of blood, scraping the hide away from the deer carcass that he had bagged with his long knife. "Hi, Joe, you slow cowpoke. Looks like you're the last one to the party. But hey, that's a nice one. Looks like that rack has got at least 2 points on mine." "Yep, unlike some SOBs, I take my time to get a big one. Looks like I'll have meat enough to give away. It took all I had just to get him up on my horse," Joe said as he dismounted. "Give me a hand, will you?" The men lifted the deer off the horse, and Steve looped a rope around its hind legs. Together they hoisted it up, hanging from the same tree limb a few feet over from Steve's kill. Joe got right to work with his sharp skinning knife, separating the deer's hide from the meat. Joe whistled while he sliced and scraped. After a little while, Steve looked over and saw that blood was spurting out of Joe's arm, and on a regular basis. "Hey, Joe, did you cut yourself? I see blood spurting," he called to Joe in alarm. Joe stopped cutting, took a quick look at a small red fountain shooting out of his left arm, dropped his knife, and instantly fainted. As he collapsed to the ground, blood continued pulsing from a deep cut on Joe's left forearm. Steve dropped his knife and whipped off his belt. He tied it tightly around Joe's arm above the cut, forming a tourniquet. He used Joe's handkerchief as a crude bandage. Joe was still out cold. He never could stand the sight of his own blood. Mingled with the deer's blood, Joe had not noticed the cut, and had already lost quite a bit of blood before Steve noticed. The crimson puddle under Joe's deer looked twice as wide as the one under Steve's. Without another word, Steve picked Joe up and slung him over his tall shoulders. He carried him to his horse and threw him over where the buck had recently lain. He abandoned their campsite, leaving the deer carcasses hanging, jumped up in the saddle and rode like the wind as fast as he could whip his horse to go. An all-out race back to the Droke place. Then he transferred Joe to the cab of his pickup truck. Joe had woken up on the rough ride back. "What happened?" he groaned out wearily. "What happened is you cut yourself real bad, buddy. You need to be still while I drive. You've lost a lot of blood. But don't worry, I'm going to get you to the doctor," Steve explained, out of breath and hurrying to start the pickup. He whipped it around and threw dust all the way as he drove back to Los Animas Gravel County Road a quarter-mile away. Then he drove 100 miles an hour down those gravel roads, spewing a rooster tail of gravel and dust that could be seen miles away. He raced all the way to the nearest doctor at the little hospital in La Junta, Colorado. This was 60 miles of the craziest driving Steve had ever done. The doctor later told both men that Steve had gotten Joe to him in the very nick of time. Joe had required almost a full blood transfusion and many stitches. Joe always credited Steve afterwards with saving his life. Years later, Joe named his first son Steve in honor of his friend, and because he had saved his life so heroically. While Joe was recovering in the hospital, he had some time to think. He thought back to his being in Hiroshima, Japan. It was about 3 months after the first atomic bomb was detonated over the civilians there. He remembered seeing shadows of people on the walls, silhouettes of unburned walls surrounded by deeply burned areas. Like many of his fellow sailors, Joe strutted around loudly, proclaiming proud victory. "We taught these slant-eyed sons of bitches who's boss." Yet every day he spent in Hiroshima brought Joe more darkness. He became very depressed and obsessed with returning home, now that the war had ended. On his next leave, he went on a wild drunken spree. 4 days later, he was in the ship's brig, sobering up. There were criminal charges against him. Life turned to shit after that. In the end, he was fortunate to have an honorable discharge from the U.S. Navy. Remembering all this made his head hurt more. He wished he had a fifth of whiskey in front of him on the hospital bed table. He would down the whole thing. After returning to the Groton Ranch, Joe put in a full week of roping, riding, and moving cattle. He was feeling very tired, but fulfilled when he drove his old pickup to the tiny town of Kim to get a bottle of whiskey. He ended up with 3 bottles. By noon on Saturday, Joe was 3 sheets to the wind and wandering aimlessly through Chilcoot Canyon. He stumbled along the sandy trail holding a mostly empty whiskey bottle dangling from his hand. He came upon old Zino tending his sheep. Zino confronted Joe immediately. "Young Joe! Joe! Mi amigo! You are drunk in the middle of the day again, my friend. Muy malo for you, I think." Zino cajoled Joe as he stared warily at him from dark, concerned eyes. Joe took a last pull on the whiskey bottle, draining it. He carelessly swung it high over his head and let it sail through the air. The bottle flew high in the air, shattering against the base of the canyon's rock wall. "No, old man, it's muy bien, muy bien. I ain't feeling no pain," Joe drunkenly shouted. Zino crossed his arms and mumbled something to himself. What's that you say, old Zino? You got something to say about my drinking? You old goat of a Mexican." Zino braced his stance and stood a little taller in his poncho, his pants tucked into his boots. "You are young. You cannot see yourself, Joe. But I say it right. You are drinking yourself to muerte, to death. If you do not stop, give up the drink, if you keep riding this drinking trail, you will wake up no more. La muerte, you will die. I can see this." Joe stared at his old friend through red-rimmed, bloodshot eyes. "Give me a bottle," he ordered Zino. Without another word, Zino started walking for his lean-to home, a few hundred yards away. Joe stumbled after him. Zino met Joe at his doorway and extended the half-full bottle of tequila. Joe grabbed it and stalked away, cussing loudly. Zino's stare could have burned a hole in Joe's back as he watched the young man stumble away. "I no trust you when you agua de fuego loco. This will be the death of you," he said to himself in Spanish as he watched Joe's back disappear down the length of the canyon. Chapter 6. A Childhood of Hiding. A skinny 12-year-old boy, wearing worn-out, hand-me-down coveralls and a reckless grin, drove an equally worn-out Model T Ford truck down a dangerous and deeply rutted dirt road on the high plains. The year was 1935. He brought the old truck to a skidding stop in front of a small log house that his late father had built on their small homestead. His mother walked out of the cabin and yelled at her son. "Joe, where did you get this vehicle? What are you doing with it?" "Old man Jameson let me borrow it. He said I could use it to make some extra money hauling hay. You know he taught me to drive it, right, Mama? He said I can use it for 2 days, so long as I keep gas in the tank," her son Joe exclaimed excitedly. His mother scowled and replied, "You take it back, right now, young man. We are already beholding enough to him and lots of other folks. You won't make more than a couple of bucks, and you'll probably break his truck, and we'll be in worse straits, because we'll have to fix it." To young Joe, it seemed like he could never catch a break. Even his own mother seemed hell-bent against him. As he ignored her and drove off in the truck to find a rancher or farmer who needed hay hauled, he cussed his mother and vowed to find his own way in the world. As Joe groggily woke up, he recognized the nightmare he had just experienced was actually based on a memory from his childhood. It was some time afterwards that he was finally able to open his eyes. That is when he realized he was in the hospital again. He felt as though he'd been run over by a truck. The doctor's penetrating stare caused Joe some alarm. Clearly the doctor was unhappy about something. "I am amazed you are awake. From my tests I was almost convinced you were brain dead. I am quite sure you have caused yourself some level of brain damage. Only time will tell. Frankly, I did not think you were going to wake up. Usually, when someone drinks themselves into a coma that lasts more than 3 days, there is no recovery. You are so lucky to be alive. Next time you will not wake up, I assure you. Alcohol is a deadly toxin to you, sir." Joe remained in the hospital for a week. There was some internal damage, he discovered. For the first time, he felt afraid of alcohol. The experience traumatized him almost as much as his bomb shock from the war, now termed PTSD. So began his transformation to an adult man. He seriously thought about never drinking another drop of alcohol, hard as he knew that would be. After Joe returned from fighting the Japanese in World War II, he had notebooks of doodles and figure sketches he had done in his spare time shipboard. Helena looked at his pencil sketches of nude young women and western scenes of crusty cowboys bucking on horses, and saw real talent. With her urging, Joe sent by mail for a correspondence course in art. He stuck with it for a couple of years, learning to paint in charcoal, pastels, watercolor, and oils. Soon he was producing large scenes on canvas of vast western scenes in a style very much western primitive. People started asking him for paintings. He would gladly give them away to friends and family. But people learned to stop asking to pay for any piece of his art. Any talk of him being a professional artist drove him over the edge. He would hide his artwork and stop talking to anyone proposing to pay him for it. After graphic arts, he took up carving rifle gun stocks and finishing them well, until they gleamed smoothly like the finest art pieces. They became almost as popular as his paintings, and like every other skill and hobby he had ever taken up, he became disinterested in a medium as soon as he felt he had somewhat mastered it. Then it was time to move on to learn something new. He learned how to play electric guitar, carve stone, dance, and cook. He avoided verbal and written communication and refused to ever speak on a rarely available telephone, unless absolutely required to. Rosie returned to the ranch 2 years later after starting formal divorce proceedings against her husband. Helena comforted her, and, of course, so did Joe. Comfort turned into dining. Dining turned into dancing. And in the end, Joe and Rosie were shacked up for days at a time in an old cabin in a remote part of the canyons. "I've got kids, you know," Rosie murmured one morning. Joe still held her in his arms. "Yeah, so they'll stay in Texas with Devon, won't they?" Joe sleepily replied. "Well, they're a part of me. We ended up together, permanent-like. I'll have at least 2 younger girls with me," she spat out. Joel rolled over from her. He stated coldly to the wall, "There is nothing permanent going on here." Joe and Rosie were formally married the next year after much secret habitation. The Drokes had long since retired and sold their small homestead to the Grodens, a more successful ranch family. Joe and Rosie moved into the Drokes' place shack of a house. Their friends did the local wedding tradition of trashing everything. They tipped over the outhouse, broke out windows, toilet papered the shack of a house, and broke beer and liquor bottles all over the place. Rosie wept through most of the night. Joe, in typical autistic defense mode, withdrew with Rosie in their bedroom, blocked the doorway with a dresser to keep the violent revelers at bay. He had nothing to say as he tried to soothe Rosie, who was not at all acclimated to the local yokel's craziness.